Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Leila Mirqaderi, and I am a PhD candidate in the Humanities Department here at Illinois Tech. My research is focused on the intersection of social media and practices of citizenship. This is the third session of this symposium, and it is titled Human Connection to Nature. And today's presenters are going to share their insights on this matter. As Professor Hilt mentioned, if you are not speaking, please mute your microphone. We are going to have 4 presentations in this session. Each speaker has about 10 minutes for their presentation and 5 minutes for individual questions. At the end of this session, we are going to have around 15 minutes for general discussion. Please feel free to leave your questions in the chat during the individual Q&A. Or during the general discussion, you can also use the raise hand feature, and you'll be able to use your microphone. If we run out of time, then we will collect unanswered questions and we'll send them to the speakers to be answered after the session is over. So our first speaker, Eleni Angelo, is a PhD candidate at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Eleni's presentation will be on the concept of wilderness. So without
New York, thank you so much for the introduction.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. May I share my screen now?
Of course. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Awesome. Terrific. Thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk about the ideal of wilderness. I think you can see my screen right now, right? You should be able to see my screen. Okay, I cannot see most of you, so that's slightly alienating, but I guess we're all used to that at this point. Sorry, something on the chat. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so today I will be talking about what I call sincere wilderness. And I will show you how this ideal, this value of wilderness, this concept of wilderness is related to environmentalism, contemporary environmentalism, environmental aesthetics, environmental ethics. And I guess this picture sort of evokes this feeling that you're probably in the wild, right? That this is the wilderness. But many of us don't really have access to this sort of settings that often. So what about this picture? Does this give us the feeling that this is wilderness? And what about this picture, right? Is this wilderness as well? So for the contemporary context, the idea of the wild, right, is highly contested. There is this sense that wilderness must refer to a place untouched by humans, pure, pristine. There's a myth of the wild. There are so many narratives, especially related to the American national identity, the myth of the frontier, right? Colonialism, class-based leisure ideals, all these sorts of things that socially constructed the idea of the wild, the wilderness. And especially in the 19th century, wilderness becomes the sacred symbol that's going to cure all the ills of civilized society by this return to the wild. So this just shows us a very short history of the idea of the wild, the wilderness. I would love to talk more about it, but I don't have enough time. So maybe in the Q&A later on. But I suppose that whether an idea is socially constructed or not is not that contested, right? More or less, all ideas are socially constructed. The question is, as Mark Woods points out, that whether or not the denotative reference of human ideas or human creations. So that brings us to the question, does really the term wilderness refer to a place? Is there a spatial location that's primitive, that has not been affected by humans? And the short answer is, of course not. We live in the Anthropocene. Everything has been touched by humans. But of course, there's this clear-cut distinction in many of us that nature with a capital N and human nature or culture are strictly distinct. And again, as Wood says, where we are, nature is not, and this creates this paradox of wilderness. So where is wilderness really? And this view is on par with a thesis called environmental realism. I'm just quoting here that the environment, nature, and wilderness are substantive real entities, and they exist independently of human institutions, practices, and experiences. But of course, our response to that could be that yes, wilderness is more or less socially constructed, but it would be worth thinking what kind of needs this social construct satisfy, right? Um, is this traditional ideal of wilderness that it's the pure, free, sacred place? But of course, who gets to spend time there, right? So this is being reduced to a socio-political argument. Um, but if we try to think about it beyond the social construction, beyond the socio-political arguments, who gets to enjoy the wild? We will find out that there is this innate human need to connect with nature, and as Burke defined in the 18th century, this need to experience the sublime, right? This need, as Thoreau says as well, to that we need the tonic of wilderness. That there's something about the wild that our human experience is, really craves, really wants to have in our lives, right? And this leads to some considerations that have to do with ethical responsibility, right? So if wild landscapes are so distinct from human experience, but we do want to spend time there, and some people do get to spend time there based on their class, etc., etc., that could mean that the wild is an escape. So that could be, as Cronin says, that wilderness represents a false hope that we're going to go into the wild. We're going to create a spatial illusion that we're going to go somewhere else, somewhere that's far from our urban environment, and our moral status is going to change automatically. And of course, this is highly problematic. And this takes us way further from becoming good environmentalists, because what matters ultimately is our values, our attitudes, our everyday life behaviors, our habits. And so the question here would be in this aesthetic appreciation debate, and in this ethical responsibility discussion, how are we going to appropriately appreciate nature? And here, my view is a hybrid view, and I think that an interpretation of Thoreau would strongly support this view. It's a combination of what Carlson and Parsons call scientific cognitivism, which simply put is just learn as much as possible about the physical world, and a view that Waltzman calls modern formalism, which says that experience the perceptual properties of natural environments. And so, for one, the distinction that I want to create, right? We started with this idea that what would be sincere wilderness? Sincere wilderness and insincere wilderness would be that in sincere wilderness, you don't feel the need to escape from ethical responsibility in the world. But for a scientific cognitivist, this need to escape is just a product of ignorance. You haven't studied nature enough. You haven't understood how the physical world works. So it's just insincere appreciation. You don't know enough, simply put. And for modern formalism, you might not be, you're just appreciating the present, right? You have this perceptual properties that you're experiencing right now, but what about the future? How are you going to know what's going to be valuable in the future so that you can preserve it and protect it? And so a question here for more formalists would be whether wilderness appreciation is present oriented, and so our ethical responsibility is very much limited within the boundaries of our present experience. Although Waltzman does suggest that we should be thinking about the aesthetic experiences that will be available in the future, and that would be a complicated, of course, consideration of what's going to be valuable in the future, and so we should be appreciating it and taking care of it, right? But that just means that ethical responsibility is also future oriented. It's not just for the present. And I combine these two views, and my proposal is that Thoreau, in his attitude and in his environmentalism, examines and appreciates nature as nature, right? Nature should be valued for what it is. It's not just an instrument, so we satisfy our needs. Everything in the physical world should be appreciated for what it is. At the same time, Thoreau is very big on the beauty of nature as this, as aspiring awe, right? This pure satisfaction of the senses that could lead to the experience of the Burkean sublime as well. And I'm just quoting here how he points out that the perceptible properties of nature have a significant value. And I do think that in this quote, Thoreau encapsulates this hybrid view of nature appreciation and ethical appreciation of nature as well. So an important point here on what I said earlier about the distinction between nature with a capital N and human nature is that our appreciation of the wild has to have this anthropocentric element, because we always begin with our human experience, right? There's no experience we have not been the center of. So we cannot view a wilderness that's distant from ourselves. There's no such thing. And we have to connect whatever scientific knowledge we acquire to our experience, to our values, to our purposes. And of course, one would point out that not everyone is willing to dive into extreme depths of scientific comprehension. So maybe a small chunk of scientific knowledge in combination with this pleasure one finds in nature could be enough to develop a good ethical, moral response. We have reached 10 minutes already. Okay. I'm gonna try to skip as much as possible. Okay, the idea of human centrism, right? It helps us, it motivates us to be good environmentalists. So that's why we begin with our human experience. This is an idea that I'll just very briefly mention, has to do with how we see nature. And I introduced this sense of quasi-agency that helps us just see nature and the ecosystems as dynamic and contingent, right? The identity is not really fixed, but we should assume that there's some sort of intentional action, and there is some optimization and decision making in nature. And now, closer to my conclusion, what can philosophy do, right? What can we do as environmental philosophers? We find ourselves up against material conditions. That's how the world is right now. And I'm just giving the example of recycling, right? And of course, philosophers are not here to tell you how we will replace plastic, for instance. That's not what we can do. But again, I find Thoreau's philosophy very helpful in trying to see how we will respond to all the different ways in which society makes it difficult to be a good environmentalist, right? And I'm just given this this suggestion about the war against convenience, right? Resisting to all the experiences that are constitutive of capitalist societies, right? So we should find ways to go against the status quo in practical ways and sort of reframe convenience. Our convenience in our capitalist societies should be in harmony with aesthetic and ethical values. And I conclude with this, with one of the most famous quotes by Henry David Thoreau, where he that's in the beginning of Walden or Life in the Woods. Why did he go to the woods? He was to live deliberately and front only the essential facts of life, right? But my argument, my claim, my suggestion in this presentation is that you don't need to go to the woods to live deliberately and be a good environmentalist, right? Because of this idea of sincere wilderness, you don't need to go far away from your urban environment to experience sincere wilderness, um, because our our experience in our urban settings should be such that we appreciate everything. We appreciate the wilderness in our backyard, in the sidewalk, everywhere that we can find it. And if we have this appropriate appreciation of nature wherever it is, we will be able to make better decisions and cultivate good environmental attitudes, and that could be very helpful. And we shouldn't be thinking about what the real wild is. Sincere wilderness is beyond spatial locations. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for the great presentation, Eleni. So we have around 1 minute. So does anyone have any questions? You can leave your questions in the chat or raise your hands. Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
All right. Eleni, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really fascinating. I took more interest in that part you said. There is an inherent desire in the human nature, in humans, to connect with nature all around. You can practically see that most times when people want to have reflections, when they want to have deep thoughts, when they want to do literary works, they withdraw. They withdraw to the woods, they withdraw to the wilderness, and try as much as they can to put their thoughts together and do whatever creative work they have at hand to do. And so my question is, it's something I'm also working on. I'm working on something in that line. Is there a way that humans, in connecting to nature psychologically, it can affect human behavior intentionally in terms of climate actions? I don't know if you get that question. Is there a way humans in relating to nature, concept of the wilderness that we developed, that it needs to be a quiet place, a cool place, psychologically, is there a way it affects human behavior in terms of deliberate actions to climate?
Right. Thank you so much for this question. I think it's a very good question. And yeah, I do think that that should be a good starting point for how our behavior will change, that we have to sort of feel that we are connected to nature. We have to have this experience. And of course, I've had this a little bit of pushback whenever I said this, simply because some people just don't feel it, right? So what are we going to say to those people who just don't feel it? They don't feel this connection with nature. So is it off the table? They're not going to be environmentalists. There's no chance they will start thinking in terms of how to protect the environment. And I guess my response to this is that, you know, with morality and with ethical decisions in general, people might not just experience it, that they owe something to others. They might not feel the responsibility. And I think that's why we have all this normative, like for those who feel it, that's why we construct all these normative frameworks. But I think my argument is that it should begin, like it's a normative idea, that it should begin. We should be motivated by this inner psychological need. So it's very, and that's the essence of human centrism, that it's about us ultimately. Nobody's gonna force it upon us to care about nature. there's something about our own experience that's going to expand into how we think about environmentalism. I don't know if I answered your question, but it was
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you
yes.
so much. Thank you. So I also have a question, but I keep it for the general discussion. Thank you again, Eleni.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure. So next, we have Marlon Lopez from Philippine Science High School. Marlon's talk is titled "The Indigenous Peoples' Perspectives on Nature as Foundation for Understanding and Remedying Climate Change." So let me turn the podium over to Marlon to start this presentation. Marlon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I will be presenting one of my researches on climate change. I have already recorded it, so that I will not be spending so much time on it. Anyway, let me allow me to share my screen.
Good afternoon there in Illinois. Good morning here in the Philippines. I am Marlon B. Lopez from the Philippine Science High School Soxargen Region Campus. This morning or this afternoon, I will be presenting my research entitled "The Indigenous People's Perspective on quote-unquote nature as Foundation for Understanding and Remedying Climate Change." So this research is actually inspired by, I am into political researches, but I have transcended into this kind of researches since one of the most pressing issues in politics is actually how to address climate change. And I believe you can never, the climate change issue is a matter of moral choices rather than political legislations. That is why we need to look into the deeper understanding of nature and how human beings should treat nature, not as another resource for exploitation, but rather a partner for coexistence or survival, rather. So let me take you first from a not very famous quote from Albert Einstein. He said that to look into or look deep into nature, and then you will understand everything better. So we are already on the technological age. We have reached a certain point of which technology has been part of our lives rather. But I believe we need to look into the most basic principle of life, wherein nature and man itself and the relationship between these two elements. So we need to understand better ourselves by looking at the nature that we are surrounded with. So there are three main parts of this research. Number one of the views of the indigenous people is nature as a life giver. Number two, nature as expression of the divine. And number three, nature in human expression. Let's take first nature as life giver. So there are a lot of creation myths, creation legends, which speaks about man being created out of natural elements. In the book of Genesis, in the Jewish religion, and it was passed to the Christian traditions. We believe that man was created from dust, and God blew life to it, and it basically man was created out of the dust, and dust is or earth is one of the elements of nature. And in the Filipino or in the Tagalog mythology story of creation, Malakas and Maganda, being the first humans to exist on earth, was created from the breaking of a bamboo. Okay, so human beings were created out of natural elements. Okay, rather than human beings creating itself or creating for himself an environment conducive for his living or for her living, actually human beings came out of these natural elements. So the belief is nature gave us life as we know it today. Number two, land as communal life source. I would like to point out one of the foremost Mindanao historian by the name of Carl Gaspar. He made a very convincing argument that land is actually the life source of the community in the pre-colonial society. Agriculture, territories, and other forms of political and economic sources or economic affairs are done in the land. The production, the agricultural production, the pangayaw or the traditional warring of tribes were done on the land. And these activities, without these activities, the people, the indigenous people, has to buy, I mean, has to have a relationship, a very good relationship to the land. And if you take out the land from the people, if you take out the land from the indigenous people, you are basically taking the life from them. You are basically killing them. So a relationship, a good relationship of the people to the land that they are occupying has to be balanced. And they view the land not as a resource for them to exploit, but rather it is a partner for their survival, as what I have already mentioned earlier. Next is nature as source of food and sustenance. Basic, of course, in agriculture, though we have some technologies today that we can produce food out of the water, but in the pre-colonial times, they are very dependent on nature, giving them source of food. It's either foraging, hunting, agriculture, everything, every food that they were serving in the tables, came from nature. And basically, when they are hunting, when they are producing food, they have to offer some offerings, some sacrifices to the gods for them to be appeased and for them to have a very good harvest. So nature is being treated as another persona, as another entity, as a partner in the survival of the indigenous people, rather than being a source of resources exploited. Okay, so the different view, I mean, the difference between the views of now and before is that the now is seeing nature as an exploited resource. And in the in the earlier times of the pre-colonial years, they are viewing nature as a partner, as a life giver for them. Number two, the second main topic that we'll be discussing is nature as expression of the divine. So we have another three here. I have already discussed this one, that legends and myths that explains the creation of the earth and the universe. That everything that you see that exists in our world was created by the gods. And basically, these elements, the trees, the rocks, no matter how inanimate they are, we need to look at it as a creation of the gods, holy. Okay, so we need to look at it not just another object, but rather another creation, the same with us. Okay, so there is this connection, there is belongingness, because they were crafted themselves. They were crafted out of the hands of the gods. That is an expression of the divine. That is an expression of the knowledge and the art of the divine. So the creation of man and the creation of the rocks are no less different. They are not different because they were crafted by the gods. So they are both holy, they are both beautiful, they are both wonderful. So what makes us humans, what makes us humans higher than these objects? The respect that the indigenous people give to these entities, to these quote unquote objects, is very much as equal as how they treat other human beings. Okay, so because man and other things on earth were created by the gods, they were appropriately given respect by the indigenous people. Number two, natural disasters as manifestation of divine wrath towards humanity. So if the gods were angry of how nature is being treated, there would be natural disasters. If a person disrespects the existence of an object, or they have disrespected some elements of nature, they were cursed. They are given sickness. They become insane. So these punishments, either communal or individual, came from the gods because human beings or an individual disrespected the object being created or that was created by a god. So the natural disaster, sickness, is actually a manifestation of the divine wrath towards how humans or an individual treat nature and objects in it. Lastly, natural elements as indicators of God's favor and or appeasement. Of course, we have punishment and we have also reward. If the gods are pleased by the human beings, they offered a very what do you call this? A very appropriate, a very fat cow, a very fat cow perhaps. Then the gods will be happy and they will be given good harvest. If a fisherman gave a very good sacrifice to the water gods, a fisherman surely will catch a lot of fish. So there is a reward and a punishment system of which it is very dependent towards how human beings please the gods by using nature as a partner to its survival. Okay, so we do not look at it on our perspective today as nature as being another resource for human survival. Lastly, we have here nature as a human expression. We have only two, nature in pre-colonial culture and nature in customs and traditions. In nature and pre-colonial culture, we have legends and myths being influenced by how we view the gods. Our ancient religions are very dependent on how or on what we were exposed to in a very frequent and continuous manner. So the people, since they are living in the nature itself, so they believe that elementals are actually living on the natural elements that they are seeing. It is not just exclusive in the Filipino perspective, but rather among other cultures, ancient cultures. Like, for example, in Egypt, they regarded, let's say, for example, the rivers. Among the ancient cultures, they believe that the rivers are gods themselves or created by the gods, if not gods themselves. So this view is actually shared among ancient cultures, not just here in the Philippines, among Southeast Asian cultures, among the great civilizations. We believe that the natural elements being created by the gods if it's not the niche, but a symbolism of the deities, of the gods in the mythologies. So the religion, as we believe on the gods, as we express our religion, that these natural elements are actually part of the creation story. I mean, the creation and the expression of the divine, as what we have already mentioned earlier. Then, this religion, or rather, the perspective of how we look at natural elements, the trees, the rocks, these are not just objects, but rather a home or a house, or I mean a habitat for the elementals, a habitat for the gods, or at least a symbolism of the gods. Utmost importance is given, utmost respect is given to these natural elements. Number two, nature in customs and traditions. Most of the poems, the legends, the myths, the epics are happening in natural setting. We were told also in creation myth like that in the Philippines, we have what you call the alamat. The alamat ng mangga, or the legend of the mango, the legend of or whatever random mountains that we have. So basically, human beings tend to explain the existence of a natural element on a very creative manner. That is why we can infer that the natural elements were very important to them, that they really wanted to explore the origins of these natural elements. And they view these natural elements as being equal to them, since, as what I've already mentioned, they were created also by the gods. Though the legends might not explain the divine origin of these natural elements, but the fact that they are part of the literature, that they are part of the poetry of the indigenous cultures, speaks of the importance of these natural elements to the existence, to the poetry, to the creativity of the indigenous cultures. Now, as a concluding statement, looking at nature as element of the existence of humanity rather than a part of its survival. In our quest to solve climate change, we tend to forget that nature has the capacity to remedy itself. However, the activities of human beings block this natural, hinders this natural healing of nature because of our activities. Since we believe that we are not part of nature, but rather the master of this nature. Okay? I tend to point out to the biblical tradition of human beings being the steward of this nature. I view it as, an arrogance towards humanity's belief that we are stewards, and we have we tend to believe this stewardship as ownership of natural elements rather than being part of this nature, being part of nature, and rather than exposing ourselves to being part of the nature, we tend to become owners and exploiters of nature. So if we stop believing that we are more than what these natural elements are, probably we might have a very fresh perspective of how we solve climate change as a problem of humanity. Thank you very much, and this is Marlon Lopez. Thank you very much for listening.
So thank you so much, Marlon, for the great presentation. Since we passed the 15 minutes, let's leave the questions for general discussion part and move on to the next presentation. Our next presenter is Agostino Serra from the University of Ferrara. Agostino has a PhD in philosophy, and his presentation today is titled The Obsolescence of Responsibility, Ethical Issues in Anthropocene. Agostino, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I try to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. So before starting my presentation, I would like to thank the organizers, Elizabeth Hild and Kelly Lass, for the opportunity to be here. Okay. This presentation is a part of a wider work on the Anthropocene I'm carrying on for some years, and that should become a book in the coming months. The basic assumption of this work is that the Anthropocene represents more than an aspirant geological epoch, that is the best candidate for becoming the meta-receipt of our age. In its essence, the Anthropocene does not correspond to the age of man, human era, or mentioned site, rather to the epoch where technology becomes the subject of both history, according to a definition by Günther Anders, and nature, although of a denatured nature that is a tech nature. In my view, the Anthropocene represents the entelechy of the technisches Zeitalter, age of technology, outlined by the classical philosophy of technology. Hence my proposal to redefine it as Technocene. In this presentation, I will sketch an ethical paradox, the paradox of omni-responsibility, emerging within the Anthropocenic framework, and especially evident in the case of so-called geoengineering solutions against ecological problems, climate change, for instance. Something I have characterized with the oxymoron technocare. The most significant effect of this paradox is the overcoming of Hans Jonas' principle, imperative, responsibility as ethical standard for the ecological thought during the last decades. My argument proceeds as follows. The first stage deals with a critical dissection of the Anthropocene as discourse. The second stage presents the Idosian Prometheanism, a new form of anthropocentrism, and the paradox of omni-responsibility as main outcomes of the Anthropocenic discourse. In the third stage, I will draw my conclusions. As well known, the term Anthropocene indicates an aspirant geological epoch, that is the third epoch after Pleistocene and Holocene of the Quaternary period. According to Paul Joseph Crutzen, the Anthropocene establishes that human activities have become so pervasive and profound that they rival the great forces of nature and are pushing the Earth into planetary terra incognita, unknown land. As said, the first stage of my argument consists of a critical dissection of the Anthropocene as discourse, namely the acknowledgement that this aspirant geological epoch equates to an ambiguous idea. In its essence, in fact, the Anthropocene emerges less as a scientific concept than as the ideational underpinning for a particular worldview, even an ideology or a paradigm dressed as epoch. In my view, the ideological character of the Anthropocene depends on the fact that it expresses the accepted meaning of an epochal matter of fact that is the complete naturalization of technology. The normative element of the Anthropocenic discourse lies in its unquestioning acceptance of the metamorphosis of techne in physis. In other words, within the present day historical configuration, technology hasn't taken on such a pervasive role that the only way it can be perceived is to interpret it as being nature itself, as being physis. However, looking this metamorphosis more closely, it turns out to be the effect of another cause. Techne can be interpreted as physis only because it has previously replaced physis in both meaning and function. This means that physis which relates techne to it was already converted according to technological parameters. The metamorphosis of techne in physis emerges therefore as an epiphenomenon in relation to the main phenomenon consisting of the preliminary metamorphosis of physis in techne, namely in that long process of diffusization or decosmization of nature, that is Max Weber's formula of disenchantment of the world, characterizing the entire modernity. We can affirm that in the epoch called Anthropocene, such a process finds its complete realization. As a consequence, the only vision yet available to us is that of a tech nature, that is, a physics without physis and a nature without logos. I now deal with the second stage of my arguments. The effort to keep together all the different requirements which take place within the Anthropocenic framework, that is, exponential growth of technology, economic development, ecological anxieties, finally produces a metamorphosis in the images of human being and nature and in their relation as well. Within this framework, human being leaves the role of the Lord of a nature conceived as object or standing reserve. I refer here to Heidegger's idea of Bestand, and takes on that of the steward of the Earth system, namely the planetary manager of a nature conceived as living being. See, for instance, Lovelock and Margulis' Gaia hypothesis. More precisely, nature becomes some kind of pet, that is something living, but entirely dependent on our capability to take care of it, and therefore something for which we must feel ourselves totally responsible. As a result, the basic link of the relation between human being and nature is to be found no more in power and domination, but rather in respect and responsibility. I define this phenomenon petification of nature. The ethical ambiguity emerging from this unprecedented scenario lies in the fact that the stewardship of the Earth system, that is our caretaking of the planetary pet, equates to an active planetary management, which can translate itself into an extensive program of geoengineering. See, for instance, the so-called artificial adding aerosols as a possible solution for the climate change. This kind of solutions proves that he who feels the burden of total responsibility also feels the obligation, that is the moral imperative, to fully exercise it. That is to say, within this new epochal context, human beings' only potential fault corresponds to lack of responsibility, which in turn amounts to abstention. The only guilt still valid in the age of total responsibility is the lack of agency. Geoengineering is de facto not only technofix, but rather technocare. That is an oxymoron, something inherently ambiguous from an ethical perspective. The combination between petification of nature, that is the characterization of planetary organisms as a pet, and absolutization of responsibility of the steward of the Earth system gives rise to the ethical paradox of omni-responsibility. On the basis of its moral and or ecological duty of total caretaking of its own environment, that is a situation where technological capability to make something becomes immediately moral obligation to do it, human being gives birth to a neo-Prometheanism, that is a new form of anthropocentrism, which shows to be not less problematic than the traditional one. As a consequence, now we are facing with two kinds of Prometheanism or anthropocentrism. On the one side, we have the traditional Prometheanism or anthropocentrism, which is the outcome of a Faustian man that sees himself as the Lord or the subject of a nature conceived as object or standing reserve. In this case, the Promethean hubris is the consequent result of this interest and irresponsibility towards the otherness of nature. On the other side, we have the anthropocenic or neo-Prometheanism, neo-anthropocentrism, which is the outcome of an Aidosian man, after Aidos, the Greek goddess of modesty and humility. Such an Aidosian man is he who feels himself only the steward of a nature conceived as living being. However, as said, this living being is thought to be unable to look after itself, namely in permanent need of total care. In this second case, Promethean hubris emerges as the paradoxical result of hyper-interest and omni-responsibility towards the otherness of nature. It represents, therefore, a classic case of heterogony of ends. I will now draw my conclusions. The main consequence of the Anthropocene, interpreted as Weltanschauung or Metarecit, is the petification of nature, namely the metamorphosis of the idea, image of nature, from an object or standing reserve, that is something to be exploited, into a pet, that is someone needing total or absolute care. On this basis, the petification emerges as a transobjectual reification of nature. This consideration suggests that the Anthropocene undermines Jonas' imperative of responsibility as ecological and more in general ethical standard in the last decades. As the age of our total responsibility, the Anthropocene represents the limit case where such an imperative, just because it can be entirely realized, unknowingly becomes the instrument of a neo-anthropocentrism, that is, an Aidosian Prometheanism. Ethically speaking, this means that the most urgent request of our age is that we acknowledge the limits of responsibility, namely the possible dangerous consequences of our best intentions when they become completely makeable or entirely feasible. At the same time, our age demands that we become aware of a brand new ethical problem, that is the potential aporia between the responsibility for the other and the respect of its otherness, namely that no authentic ferent bortum responsibility is possible without Gelassenite releasement. Otherwise, the acknowledgement of this aporia as new ethical challenge could also indicate the first stage for its overcoming, or the first philosophical step for the building of an ethical paradigm good enough for this brand new epoch. This first step corresponds to a renewed dialogue between Jonas and Heidegger. It is an encounter between responsibility and releasement. Besides the Verantwortung imperative, we need a Gelassenheit imperative. As a conclusion, we can already announce the basic rule of this imperative, that is, the authentic responsibility must be able to acknowledge and preserve the value of the difference as an irreplaceable epiphany of otherness. The real measure of an authentic responsibility is one's own taste for the otherness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. So we have around 2 minutes. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Yelena, you can ask your question.
Sorry, it was not a question. It was more uploading for the presentation.
Oh.
But I can actually ask a question. I thought it's really a thought-provoking presentation. So I have a question, more like a clarificatory question, actually. So if I understood well, so I wonder whether your so if I understood well, one, maybe we can rethink the way we think about responsibility, not as taking action, but actually as not interfering or not taking action. So in that sense, I think what I want to say is, if ethical imperative is to show respect for the environment, that can be compatible with some view on what responsibility is about. It's just responsibility not to interfere. I don't know how much sense I'm making, but so I just wonder whether you want to say that, let's say, more non-anthropocentric views are those which in a way require like giving up on this notion of responsibility altogether. I don't know how much sense I'm making.
Yes, I try to answer. I think the problem is this very short presentation, so I had to put together so much things probably. So I try to say only one thing. My idea is that the technological development becomes in the Anthropocene a kind of moral and ethical transcendental. That is the condition of possibility for an ethic. I mean, the responsibility paradigm, in my view, works very well where when the idea of a total responsibility remains a kind of utopia, when it's unreleasable. But when technology gives us the possibility to really to realize in concrete a total caretaking of nature, this destroys, so to say, the responsibility paradigm as announced by Jonas or as traditionally conceived. So this is the focus of my work. This is in my view, the most interesting ethical anthropological implication of Anthropocene as interpreted as Metarecit or Weltanschauung, so to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, Agostino. Since we passed the 15 minutes, let's leave the rest of the questions for general discussion part and move on to the next presentation. Our last speaker for this session is Alexander Erich from University of Oxford, United Kingdom. Alexander's presentation is titled Ecotage as Other Defense. Whenever you are ready, Alexander, please start.
Thank you very much. So I've shared a very brief handout with everybody in the chat. If anyone has problems downloading that, then do let me know and I can try to work out another way of getting it to you. But yeah, ecotage is the intentional destruction of property conducted with the aim of furthering environmental ends. So on this broad definition, a huge variety of acts qualify as ecotage. Putting sand in the fuel tanks of SUVs, destroying fishing trawlers' nets, or even blowing up oil pipelines can all be instances of ecotage if they are performed with the aim of furthering environmental ends. Now, the class of acts satisfying this definition is so broad for two reasons. First, property is a broad term, meaning anything that is legally owned. And second, environmental ends themselves are numerous: reducing CO2 emissions, promoting or protecting biodiversity, or reducing other forms of pollution can all plausibly qualify as environmental ends. Now, before launching into the argument, a brief note on why it's important to think about ecotage at all. It's important, I think, because numerous radical environmentalist groups engage in or encourage ecotage as a legitimate form of environmental action. Further, as the time remaining to solve the climate crisis grows ever shorter, and the activist tool of non-violent civil disobedience proves itself ever more incapable on its own of forcing a solution to the climate crisis, then direct action like ecotage is surely going to become a more prominent part of the climate movement. This is a classic case then of ethics having to catch up with practice. So the argument. The main claim that this paper makes is as follows. Instances of ecotage are pro tanto justified insofar as they are instances of effective and proportionate other defense. Now, pro tanto is important here because whether a particular instance of ecotage is overall justified in the sense of being either permissible or required is of course dependent on situational factors that we can't hope to consider completely in the abstract: the who, the what, the why, the when, and the where. But the main claim that I make here is that acts of ecotage are, at least in one way, justified insofar as, or to the extent that, they are instances of other defense. So an outline of the argument as it is presented on your handout sheets. Premise 1. Runaway climate change will severely harm many present and future people. Certain agents or climate aggressors culpably and wrongly engage in activities that contribute enormously to climate change, for example, oil companies. Thus, these climate aggressors are culpably and wrongly harming many present and future people. Aggressors make themselves liable to defensive harm when they culpably and wrongly harm others, who we can call victims. Victims, or agents acting on victims' behalf, are pro tanto permitted to defensively harm aggressors, provided that this defensive harm is effective and proportionate. Thus, climate aggressors are liable to defensive harm, and climate victims, or agents acting on their behalf, are pro tanto permitted to effectively and proportionately defensively harm them. Given that sabotage of a climate aggressor's property, or ecotage, is a harm that can be both proportionate and effective at halting or slowing a climate aggressor's climate change causing activities, then ecotage, as an instance of effective and proportionate other defense, is pro tanto justified. So this, in outline, is the argument. The rest of this talk goes through it step by step, and very, very briefly, sadly, addresses the main potential issues along the way, hopefully showing it to be sound. So let's start with premise 1. Runaway climate change will severely harm many present and future people. Now, I think that this is clearly true. Of course, its truth depends on a satisfactory resolution of the non-identity problem, i.e. we need some account of harm that explains how future people are harmed by climate change, even though they owe their existence to it. Now, this is unsurprisingly a task that I don't undertake in this paper, but all that's important here, surely, is that P1 is in fact true on some plausible account of harm. If it weren't, then why bother doing anything to mitigate the climate crisis at all? Premise 2 requires a bit more unpacking. Premise 2 tells us that certain agents culpably and wrongly engage in activities that contribute enormously to climate change. Now, note that with this claim, I have in mind primarily certain collective agents like large oil companies or big logging companies, industrial farmers, rather than individual agents like you or me. Now, this isn't to get us individuals off the hook, but it's because these climate aggressors contribute far more to climate change than any particular individual does. Therefore, if anything follows morally from contributing to climate change, then we'll be able to see this most obviously by focusing on these collective agents. So the first thing that needs to be done here is to show that these climate aggressors, oil companies, meat processing firms, etc., are in fact agents capable of acting culpably and wrongly at all. Now, that they are, I think, is presupposed by our practice and our discourse. We treat these entities as if they are agents, both in law and in conversation, when we say things like, Shell did this, BP has been found guilty of that, etc., etc. Now, of course, I'm happy to talk more about this in questions, but without getting too deep into the metaphysics of agency, I think we should take our responsibility practices at face value here. When we talk as though these entities are agents, we make no mistake. So accepting this, it still needs to be shown that these agents are culpable for their climate change causing activities and that these activities are wrong. Now, to justify the claim that they're wrong, we don't need to assume a particular account of wrongness. Instead, we can note that these activities have a multitude of features that, either individually or taken together, are wrong-making on most plausible accounts of wrongness. So oil companies, for example, have known about how their activities contribute to climate change and about its harmful effects for many years. Further, that these activities contribute enormously to climate change is also clear. It's a well-worn fact that just 100 companies have emitted 71% of all the greenhouse gas emissions since 1998. Further, that these harmful activities have, at least for some time, been avoidable in virtue of the fact that alternative green technologies exist, is surely together sufficient to demonstrate the wrongness of these acts. Also, the knowledge condition here is, I think, sufficient to generate culpability. Knowingly causing some harm is enough to make one culpable, if not yet fully responsible, with respect to that harm. So we've seen so far that certain entities contribute far more to climate change than others. These entities can properly be called agents, albeit collective ones. These collective agents, in many cases, engage in climate change causing activities culpably and wrongly in virtue of their doing so in full knowledge of their avoidable and harmful effects. Premise 2 then is true. So to bring this all together, as the next claim does, we get the claim that climate aggressors are culpably and wrongly harming many present and future people. So next, premise 3. Aggressors make themselves liable to defensive harm when they culpably and wrongly harm others or victims. Now, this premise clearly goes very closely together with premise 4, which tells us that victims or agents acting on their behalf are pro tanto permitted to defensively harm aggressors, provided that this defensive harm is effective and proportionate. Now, these are some very important results in the literature on self and other defense that sadly I cannot fully justify here, of course. But very briefly, the justification is as follows. When you violate another's right not to be harmed, you waive your own right against harm. And in other words, you no longer enjoy the protections afforded to you by this right because you've violated the similar right of another. As such, you make yourself liable to certain harms that the right had previously protected you against. Now, importantly, of course, making oneself liable to some harm is not to make oneself liable to all harms. Now, this is where premise 3's reference to defensive harm comes in. The harms that an agent makes themselves liable to upon violating the rights of others are only those that are strictly defensive. Sorry. And premise 4 clarifies what legitimate defensive harms are. They are harms that are firstly proportionate to the original wrongful harm, and secondly effective at neutralizing or preventing this wrongful harm. Now, I can't spell out these conditions in detail, and of course, I'm happy to talk about them more in questions, but just note that in the literature on self and other defense, proportionality and efficacy are two important conditions on the permissibility of defensive harm. So to briefly sum up so far, because the climate aggressor makes themselves liable to defensive harm by wrongfully harming climate victims, then victims or agents acting on their behalf are pro tanto permitted to defensively harm climate aggressors. This is provided that the defensive harm is effective and proportionate. This is what premises 3 and 4 tell us. Now, premise 5 is the claim that sabotage of a climate aggressor's property, or ecotage, as I've called it, is a harm that can be both proportionate and effective at halting or slowing their climate change causing activities. Now, depending on its scale in a given case, ecotage can surely be a harm that is both proportionate to an aggressor's wrongful harms and effective at halting or slowing these harms. That it can be proportionate is clear. What is the blowing up of a pipeline when the well-being of countless future generations is at stake? The efficacy of ecotage is more controversial, but just quickly, I want to point out at least 2 robust mechanisms through which ecotage can, in theory, halt or slow an aggressor's climate change causing activities, and which we might think can be effective. Yes, I'm almost finished, sorry. So first we have its direct effects. Obviously, if the property destroyed by an act of ecotage is itself involved in environmentally destructive activity, then destroying this property directly halts this activity. Second, we have its indirect effects on the climate aggressor. Ecotage creates an investment risk that makes it costly for polluters to engage in further polluting activities. Knowing that their polluting infrastructure is threatened by the credible threat of destruction, climate aggressors will be less likely to invest in such infrastructure in future. We have good reason to accept then that ecotage can be effective and proportionate under certain conditions. So the conclusion then follows from all that we've said so far. Ecotage, as an instance of effective and proportionate other defense, is pro tanto justified. To finish, a very quick final thought on how I've talked about things here. I framed my discussion of ecotage and the climate crisis in very combative terms, in terms of aggressors, victims, defense, and attack. This, I think, is a valuable way of thinking about the climate crisis, albeit one that is not often employed. Climate change isn't just an accidental process with respect to which we are all innocent passengers. It's a problem that is, in large part, engineered wrongfully by those who profit from the harms that it brings. Perhaps by seeing the crisis in these terms, as a struggle between perpetrators and victims, we can more clearly come to see the normativity of the situation at hand, namely that certain actions, like ecotage, which may be impermissible in a context of justice, become permissible in the unjust world in which we live. Thank you, and sorry for going a bit over time.
Thank you so much for the great presentation, Alexander. So does anyone, we have around 2 minutes for this presentation. Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Question from Matthias, I think.
Matthias, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's Matthias. Thank you, Alexander. That's really fascinating. Just yesterday I was teaching Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and this kind of argument is what's missing in that book, I find. But just very quickly, because we don't have much time. So you ended on the note of saying that that you framed all of this in combative terms. So there's victims and aggressors, and we need that relatively clear distinction here. The distinction may be, of course, somewhat problematized by the fact that one, the aggressors, like oil companies, are acting under competitive conditions where they can always say, if we don't do it, someone else will. And secondly, we're all, or many of us, are profiting in some way from this cheap energy that we've been using for a long time now, since the steam engine. So in some sense, we're participants in this as well. We're buying the products that make the aggressors do what they do. So the distinction between victims and aggressors is a bit more complicated, perhaps. Thank you.
Yeah. No, yeah, that is a very, very good question, and sort of in a slightly longer presentation, I would aim to sort of engage with a little bit more. I guess sort of two very quick points to say in response to that. I completely agree that in the sort of context of a pervasively unjust economic system in which we live, sort of the vast majority of us are simultaneously both victims and perpetrators, and sort of the difference between the different agents within that system is sort of not straightforwardly one of type kind of thing between those who are victims and those who are perpetrators, but sort of one of differing degrees of culpability. Like certain agents are sort of more perpetrators than they are victims, and sort of those agents bear a greater degree of responsibility than others. Also, I don't focus on individual agents because you mentioned quite rightly that sort of one defense that we might give almost like on behalf of the oil companies is that sort of they're merely responding to competitive pressures within like an economic system. And sort of this argument, I think, like successfully mitigates the responsibility of individuals for their actions within an economic system, or at least goes some way to mitigating their responsibility, because individuals have no power to sort of create the economic system in which they live. Whereas these large oil companies have such enormous economic power that I think they can sort of properly be conceived of as sort of both receivers of, but also creators of the economic system in which they operate. You know, they spend many millions of pounds per year sort of lobbying for sort of certain certain policies, for, you know, lobbying for a certain sort of economic context in which they can act. So I guess the sort of short summary of that is just that these large collective agents are almost like doubly responsible for their actions, because they both do the actions but also help to create the context in which they act, kind of.
Thank you so much, Alexander, again. So now that the presentations are over, we have a general discussion session. If you have a question from any of the speakers, please raise your hand and we will go from there. Andrew, do you have a question? Can go ahead and.
Yeah, so I wrote this down because it's complicated, and it's addressed to the last three speakers. So I'd be glad to hear from any of them. And I'll read it. It's probably an overstatement I'm making, but it seems to me that the last three talks, that's Lopez, Sarah, and Arid, the three present powerful criticisms of climate damaging activities and also propose solutions to them through such ideas of abuse of nature, hubris-driven technology, and the recommendation of ecotage to deal with these. Now that the criticisms have been well stated, are there positive actions that one or we should responsibly take to mitigate climate change from these points of view? Another way to ask it is, are there organizational programs now in existence, such as XR, Extinction Rebellion, 350.org, and so on, that because of the views of the last three speakers, we should support or foster more strongly than others? Or, going back to Gardner, are we missing an important kind of organization, like a global constitutional convention? And is there an organization any of these three speakers would recommend or think we should create to foster what they think needs to be done?
Shall I go first, very briefly? Thank you very much for your question. I guess sort of one presently existing organization that springs to mind is Ende Gelände in Germany, who are sort of like a German version of Extinction Rebellion, and they engage in sort of far more direct tactics than sort of purely like non-violent civil disobedience that Extinction Rebellion and other such groups engage in. And they've had sort of great success recently, or certainly pre-pandemic, of sort of closing down some of Germany's largest coal mines, if sort of albeit temporarily, but certainly have sort of made some progress there. So yeah, that's one recommendation.
Can you name that organization again? I didn't quite hear or spell it. I don't.
I'll type it in the chat because my German pronunciation.
Thank you.
Okay, go next.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for that wonderful question. So my sister actually presented a research yesterday, Minerva Lopez, about the involvement of the Diocese of Marbel in the fight or the struggle against the open pit mining here in South Cotabato. The Diocese of Marbel has been very active. They were already fighting for the banning of the open pit, and they were successful of that. However, because of the official announcement or pronouncement of the government in lifting the ban to open pit mining here in Tampakan, there was already a reconsideration of the environmental code of the province. That is why 7 watersheds are now threatened by the opening again of the open pit mining here in South Cotabato, and it would affect, at least in my count last, is 8 to 9 provinces. These are watersheds, and these are major water sources for these 8 or 9 provinces. So if I were to recommend a very powerful organization which really strive for the protection of the environment, it would be the Diocese of Marbel here in the Philippines, since they were already very much involved in the fight against the open pit mining. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes, I tried to say something very briefly as answer. May I?
Yes, sure, of course.
Okay. I don't have a real answer for this question, because I tried to take another perspective on the Anthropocene as a epochal phenomenon. That is, I try to interpret it as a kind of final evolution of the age of technology. For this reason, in my personal view, is interesting, but for example, a little bit limited the perspective of the so-called political Anthropocene. I mean, the interpretation of Anthropocene as Capitalocene or Oliganthropocene by Fresos, Benuil, and Malm, Ormborg, and other scholars. So I don't have a right answer on this point. Sorry.
Thank you.
We have one question from Andrew. Oh yeah, go ahead, Matthias. You have a question?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to follow up with Agostino, if I may. So I wanted to say that the Anthropocene can also be seen as decentering. The notion of the Anthropocene can be seen as decentering the human, and there are some interpretations of the term in that way, because it presents the human as merely a geological force and not as an agent. And the other point was really a question about the ending, when it seemed to me that you were presenting Heideggerian Gelassenheit or letting be or releasement as standing side by side with the imperative of responsibility. So you said we also need the imperative of Gelassenheit. Maybe I misunderstood, but I would tend to think that on a Heideggerian account of the Anthropocene, which Heidegger sort of criticized before the term became used, Gelassenheit would be the source of normativity for anything like responsibility. So it wouldn't be that you would have on the one hand an imperative of Gelassenheit and on the other hand an imperative of Jonassian responsibility. It would be rather that Jonassian responsibility would have to be seen as emerging out of a reorientation of the human being vis-a-vis the earth and the world, which would be the source of the normative for anything like responsibility. Would you agree, or did I misunderstand?
More or less, I have to confess that your English is too good, and my English understanding is too bad. So I'm not be sure that I really understood everything right. But to say something, what I as said, my interest has to do with the what is happening from an ethical and anthropological perspective. Starting from my assumption is internal to the question concerning technology, another Heideggerian typical topic. And in my view, as said, Anthropocene is the entelechy of this movement of the growing of technology as epochal phenomenon. On this basis, as said, I'm interested in the dysfunctioning of the traditional ethical and anthropological parameters. So I understand what you mean, but so I had and I have a lot of conflicts with a lot of scholars in the Anthropocene studies and in the philosophy of technology due to my probably too Heideggerian or too continental approach to the question of technology and to the Anthropocene. Sorry, I cannot give you a better answer now. If you want, I can send you some papers I wrote on these topics. So sorry.
Yes, Peter, for the last question, you can ask the last question.
Okay, my question actually should have gone to Minerva Lopez, but I don't think she's around. But her brother is here, Marlon Lopez, and
Yes, Peter, I'm here.
so I think maybe you could stand in for your sister a bit. I took a question down yesterday while she was presenting, and later on, because of the speed of trying to catch up with our time was fast spent. By the time I wanted to ask the question, she had already left before the meeting. So I don't know if I could pose that question to you. In the course of her presentation, she stressed on the fact, and you also stated it a bit not long ago when you said something here, that the Diocese of Marbella played a great role in trying to stop mining activities. And so my question was, that was presently. Are the diocese still? What are some of the activities the diocese is doing right now to sensitize people still on environmental behavior to the climate? They understand my question. Yes.
I think I can answer the question of Peter, since I was also involved in some of the actions of the diocese in the last, I think, 4 or 3 years in my involvement in the research. But anyway, most of the steps that were taken, most of the actions that were taken by the diocese of Marbella in the struggle for the ban for the open pit mining was really to engage the indigenous community, to let them understand that there is this danger of that there are dangers with the open pit mining, they are engaging the indigenous community that they might consider, because of course that's their personal decision, that they may understand really that the money that they will be getting from these big mining companies will not be, I think, will not suffice whenever the dangers would become a reality already. So they're also engaging the indigenous community to really think of the decisions that they are making. So much of their actions are really engaging the indigenous community, since here in the Philippines we have the IPRA law, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, that really protects the ancestral domain of our indigenous community, that they might not be exploited by foreign or domestic companies, that their rights will be protected also. So much of their actions are really engaged the indigenous community, that they will understand, that they were really to understand the dangers of these mining operations, and much more that the Diocese of Marbella also is involved in the policy making, or influence the policy making, since of course most of the governments really respect the separation of the church and the state. However, the church has a bigger influence in the followers and their followers. So more of the convincing the government, local government, to really uphold the IPRA law, uphold the Laudato Si of the Catholic Church, and to really pressure the government to really stand for the rights of the indigenous community and the common good, or the general welfare of the people. I hope I answered the question.
All right. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Now we are officially at the end of this session. I'm collecting unanswered questions from the chat, and we'll send them to the speakers after the session. Many thanks to the speakers and for their great presentation, and thank you for everyone for participating. We have a break until 10:25 a.m. Central Time, and session 4 starts right after the break. Thank you all.